Good evening. Happy to have all of you here this evening. We'll start in just a second. We've spent lessons talking about the history of the church, and we actually, if you were here last Wednesday night, it was lesson 3, and then because of Isaac Hall's health issue, I had the lesson for tonight already prepared, so we taught it on Sunday. So if you weren't here Sunday evening, you missed lesson 4, and I apologize for that, but we're going to go on without you. So hopefully you'll be able to catch back up with us just a bit. But what we talked about on Sunday evening were external causes of apostasy. When we say external, we mean, of course, things from the outside. Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about internal, but more along the lines of fruits, okay? We read in the Bible about the fruits of the Spirit, right? The fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, all of that. But what are fruits of the Spirit? Not necessarily what are the names of them, but what is fruit of the Spirit? And we read in the Bible about trees that bear good fruit and bear bad fruit. And what do we do with trees that bear bad fruit? Yeah, so the idea of fruit, fruit can be judged, and fruit isn't judged until it's after that don't produce well. And there are some trees that have branches that don't produce as well as maybe the other branch does. So when we talk tonight about fruits of apostasy, these are things that will let you be the judge of whether this was good or bad. We'll let you make the determination of whether this is a positive fruit or a negative fruit. We're actually going to talk about that both this week and next Wednesday night as well. And so we'll talk about a few of these things here as we go. I don't think we'll go as long tonight as we did last Wednesday night. So hopefully that'll go well. But I want to mention a couple of things about internal to start with. And if external are things that are happening on the outside, then internal are things that are happening on the inside. And one of the things that we'll mention here, and it actually probably would make sense to us, is that as you see there, periods of peace often were periods of weakness. Periods of peace often led to decline in spiritual devotion. This makes sense. How many of you pray more when something bad is happening than when something good is happening? I think we all probably do. And we all relate. And it's not even that when something good is happening that you're not praying, but it's like you focus harder on it. When a sibling or a relative is in the hospital, or like what we've seen in North Carolina and Tennessee and Georgia and places here in the last few days, places that I think about those places about once a year when I drive through them. But now I think about them every day because, like Tom said, they're, you see it on the news and you hear about it and you see roads and you think, I've driven across that road, and you feel bad for those people. But sometimes when it's peaceful, sometimes when things are going swimmingly, we don't really focus too much on religion, right? Well, it's all going well, and that's fine, okay? One of the things that sometimes happens when things go well can be seen in Revelation chapter 3, verses 15 through 19. You'll be familiar with this, but I want us to read it here. This Revelation chapter 3, verses 15 through 19. I believe we're in Laodicea is where this is happening when we read this. But Don, do you care to read this for us? Revelation 3, 15 to 19.
I know your works, that you are neither cold nor hot. You are cold or hot. So then, I thought you were lukewarm, neither cold or hot. I will vomit you out of my mouth. So when you say, I am rich, you have become wealthy, and have need of nothing. You do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked. I counsel you to buy from my gold refined in fire, that you may be rich, white garments, that you may be clothed, that the shame of your nakedness may not be Many as I love, I rebuke you, Satan. Therefore, be jealous and repent.
And this is a series of statements made about various churches in Asia Minor, what we talked about last week, that all have different issues. And if you look through the Bible, this is actually the seventh of them. But before it, it's the faithful church and the corrupt church. You can look at the persecuted church, the compromising church. But this one is called the lukewarm church. And lukewarm means you're not so great and you're not so bad. And it's kind of right there in the middle. But it's interesting, the words in red here, Jesus says that he kind of wishes what for this church? Kind of wishes one or the other. I feel like he's saying, I really wish you were good, doing great. But why might he also say, I kind of wish you were just bad? Because you're neither. Yeah, you're neither. I had a student come up to me today and ask about improving her grade. And she has a B. And she said, is there any way I can do some extra work to get an A? And I said, well, let me go back and look and see what you've got here. What do the grades look like? She's done every assignment. Most of them have had pretty good grades. She doesn't have anything missing. And I told her, I said, well, I'll figure something out. I can make something happen. But it's kind of hard to look. I almost wish she came to me and said, I've got a 20%. How can I improve it? Because I could have said, well, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, and we're going to do this. And the ones that have 100 don't come and ask for anything more. But she's kind of right in the middle, and I have a hard time really telling her what we can do to improve that. It's the same sort of thing right here. Mary. Right. Right. Yeah, can be. Others. Ben? Yeah.
I don't want to do extra work.
Right.
I'm not over here, so I'm in the middle. That's kind of good. That's where I want to be.
Right.
Try to be that to the far right rather than to the left.
And then if you didn't hear him, he's saying there that, we kind of, as long as we're in the middle, we don't have to do a ton of extra work, but I'm not failing the class either. I'm right here. D. Hold on just a second. True. Absolutely. Others. Oh, I heard somebody else. All right. So let me we'll look at a couple of other things. Now, there's a few things that we start to see right in here, but I want to mention a couple. Usually when we talk about things are doing good, things are going well, maybe financially for us. It's just an example. But the church, which started off as people who really had nothing, and they sold what they had to sort of work together and live together, over time that changes. Especially once the church becomes recognized by Rome, then it becomes a little bit more acceptable to be a Christian. We talked the other night about various Roman emperors and how they, their goal was just to kill as many Christians as possible. But once it becomes accepted, well, then the threat isn't really there. So I don't have to really fret and worry about possibly dying. The example is given of when the rich man walks into church, basically, what did they do for that man? Right here. And I need everybody to walk by and see this person. But the guy that came in that was poor, that was wearing rags, what? In the back, I guess we're glad you're here, but, that's not a great reflection on us, perhaps. Well, as James writes there, he says, is that the way we should approach this? Absolutely. So why do people do that? Why do we still sometimes do that? Mm-hmm. Take both of those answers. We think too much of ourselves, and we think so much of ourselves because, as you said, we love the praise of men right there. And sure,
We think bad of somebody just because of the way they look.
absolutely.
The other day, I was working in a rich neighborhood. I was in my uniform. And they come and told my truck, so I was waiting for my lift driver. But just based on my appearance, two of them called the law.
Right.
And said there was this, dangerous looking guy going in the street. We need to get him out of here. And so the sheriff kind of got me out of it. But we do that. We judge people a lot of times based on appearance.
They might have been right. Who knows? It's never really know. But it's real easy to, and that's somebody just looking out the window or driving past in a split second. Go ahead. Maybe so. Perhaps so. Perhaps so. All right. So let's jump ahead then to a couple of other things that were internal. All right. We talked about last week, or I'm going to say last week. I don't remember if it was Wednesday or Sunday, but just bear with me. Last time, we talked about how that Christianity had emerged out of the Jewish faith. We talked about Jesus being Jewish, and a lot of other Jewish people. And one of the issues that Christianity faced was the issue of maintaining Judaism in Christianity. You'll see this sometimes referred to as what I've got here as Judaizing Christians. This idea that the commands of the old law, the Old Testament, had to be incorporated into Christianity. One of those examples is circumcision. Acts chapter 15 and verse 1. Linda, do you care to read that? So if we look at this, it says here, Acts chapter 15 and verse 1, they came down and they were teaching to the brethren. So when we use the word brethren there, what do we mean? To the church, to Christians. They teach to these Christians, they say, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, change the word custom of Moses. What would we change that to? The law of Moses, the old law, the Old Testament, whatever you want to call it at the time. You what? What's the last three words? Cannot be saved. Okay. Now that's not what we've seen anybody teach, but why might that teaching be presented? It's the way they'd always done it. This is a cultural thing at this point, because we've talked about how Judaism leads into Christianity. Well, if we have these cultural ties, then they need to stay in the religion as well, even though there's not necessarily a book, chapter, and verse for it. Now, was there a book, chapter, and verse for circumcision under the old law? Absolutely there was. But when did the old law disappear? On the cross. This is Acts chapter 15. Jesus is already dead at this point. So that's gone. That's not there anymore. So why are they still teaching it? It was custom. Are we ever guilty of wanting to buy? And I don't mean we, but just Christianity in general. Is Christianity in general sometimes guilty of binding custom as law? Can we think of any examples? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. These are, and we kind of laugh about it, but I guarantee every one of you would notice if we sang 7 songs on Sunday instead of 6. And some of you would probably say, I wonder why we sang 7 songs for. Right? I ain't looking at anybody, but I know who'll be talking about it. Say it again. Sure. Yeah. And there's any number of things that we could do, and we could go further into that. The point, this is just an example of how the church was still sort of tethered to this Jewish custom. And in many ways, we're going to see it here in a minute, the church had a hard time breaking that. It's still, in some ways, tethered to Jewish customs. We'll talk about that here in just a second as well. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Lucille. I didn't mean to. Yeah. So tithing, and Ben, you've studied this and talked more about it than I would probably be able to. But the idea of 10% or whatever it might be, and I know Ben has taught classes and spoke about how that's not just money, but it's work and and crops and all that. But it's sort of a tethered to that kind of thing as well. I'm going to do the math on this, and we'll say, well, here's carrying the one and round up whatever. It's the same sort of thing. And we talked about how giving to the church, most people that stand up here and speak before we give usually say something along the lines of what? Be a cheerful giver. What's in your heart, right? And if you're dividing the fraction all the way down, and if you're 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 decimal points out trying to figure out the rounding, is that a cheerful heart or is that an accounting figure? That's an accounting figure. Jesus had dealt with similar things as well. And he talks about the futility of trying to combine new and old. Trying to combine new and old. I want to look at Matthew chapter 9. This is verses 15 through 17 right here. Sue-Ann, do you care to read this? So when we read this, what we're really seeing Jesus say is that you try to merge Christianity and Judaism. You can make this sort of work, but there's always going to be something come up. We just read about circumcision, but there was the question about what foods should you be able to eat. Should you eat meat as a Christian or should you not? Well, what did Paul and them, what did they come up with on that? That was the old law, right? What did they come up with in the, what was the? Sure. But on the flip side, what did he also say about eating things like meat? Absolutely. If it offends, if you are, for an easy example, if you are a vegetarian and you invite me over to eat at your house, I shouldn't fuss at you because we aren't having steaks or hamburgers. I know what I'm going to. Now, does that mean that I might not drive through McDonald's on the way going and the way back? I might do that. But I'm not going to say, well, this is what it's got. You have made that decision. But at the same token, if I invite you over and we're grilling out hamburgers and hot dogs and you don't eat them, I'm not going to fuss at you. But that doesn't mean that we can't maybe have it at my house. But that's custom. That's not a religious decision. Yes, sir. Right. And we've talked about this before, but the old law is very much a checklist. It's very much, I'm doing this, I'm doing this, I'm doing this. But there's a lot of work, but there's not a lot of heart necessarily in it. In the new law, there's more heart that's emphasized than under the New Testament. I give because I want to give. I'm going to eat because I don't want to offend you necessarily. Those are a huge difference between the two. Now, we can go a little bit further right here. A couple of things. I will probably pronounce it wrong, and we'll try not to pronounce it wrong here as we go. But the word there at the top, S-Y-N-O-D. I'm going to let y'all get it wrong first, and then I'll try. Look at all y'all just making noises back there. All right. It's actually pronounced synods. S-I-N is emphasized, and then I-D at the end. I think it should be synod or synod or synods or whatever. Well, we want to pronounce it like synagogue. Anyway, synods and councils. All right, synods and councils. And so a couple of things here. Before, as you see, before the close of the 2nd century. So we're 150-ish years after the death of Jesus. So by this point, we've also seen the apostles gone as well. And so smaller churches had started to call upon larger churches for help with problems that they were having. Now, we saw this the other night when we talked about bishops and elders, and you'll see the same thing here in just a second. But why might a smaller church call upon a larger church for help? Perhaps they'd encountered those problems before. Why else might they? Resources, money or human resources or physical things that you might need. Maybe so. All of that. So there's really nothing wrong with that. You may be familiar with churches that don't have a preacher. And there are organizations or there are churches that Richmond was one that would do this, that would send preachers to other places to preach and teach. Because without it, they don't have a preacher at all. They don't have a teacher that would be there. I think Richmond called it their Go Ye program, if I'm not mistaken. But these kind of things happen. We're going to send money to help an area. Boo, I remember several years ago there was flooding in Gatlinburg, and you had went to the church down there, but they had to rebuild their church because it just got washed away or whatever. And I know you went a few times. They weren't even in it yet. They were still trying to get it built. This is something that would happen. But the hierarchical structure that we talked about, they start saying, well, then you've got this person in charge, and then these people, and then these people. That's what we see there in the second bullet point, that this takes the form of what we would call a convention today. Convention is probably a more common word for Americans. I think council was the Latin word and Senate is the Greek word. But you see the emergence of bishops and then archbishops, the arch being higher. And then you have all these different groups. And so there's this structure that has been removed from the original plan of the church. Each congregation was to be autonomous with elders, a plurality of elders that we've talked about leading that. Is this church supposed to help those that are in need? Absolutely. And we should do it when there's a need. Okay. But can we help every person in every group all the time? Why not? We don't have the resources. But what if there was a hierarchical group that said you have to help this group by sending this amount of money? Who's making the decision there? The higher up. The higher up. And so we start to see an emergence of these organizations that still exist in Christianity even today. So these words that we saw, they're legislative bodies. They're called synods or they're called councils. But they enacted laws that become bound upon all, but as if they were coming from the Word of God, right? And they're not there in the Word of God. This is in opposition to numerous teachings. I've got 3 things that are up there: 2 Peter 1, Jude 3, and Galatians 1. We read Galatians 1 the other night, but we're going to read all 3 of these here once again, just as examples. So let's look at 1 Peter 1 and verse 3. Shelby, can you read it? All right, so if we look at that right there, what does that say? Has given to us all things. Where are those all things given to us? In the scripture, right? And so we're going to look there to find, maybe the answer. All right, this is Jude 3 here next. Tom, can you read Jude 3, sir? All right, and we see right here, the faith which was once for all delivered to the saints. All right, so there's a couple things I want to break down here. First of all, delivered once, meaning what? Okay, good. All right. Delivered for who? I worked backwards there. I'm sorry, but delivered for who? For all, right? So that's for me. That's for you. That's for people that have long since passed. That's for people to come forward. That's for people that are in Asia or Africa or Australia or South America, wherever it might would be. But it's delivered to who then? To the saints. Who is that? And that is a term that sometimes gets misused as well. We read this the other night, but we'll read it again. Galatians chapter 1, verses 6 through 9. Nobody need to care to read this? And you can see sort of there in between. We talked about this the other day, but there won't be any other gospel that's there. This is why, and this is Paul writing to the Galatians saying, if somebody if even one of us walks in and says, I've got a new idea, then he says, then that we, the apostles, would need to be accursed there as well. Questions about that? Yeah. So what we've seen here and what Dad read there just as well, some examples of scriptures that we have what we need right there. Now, does that mean that there won't be issues arise that the scriptures would have been unfamiliar with? Absolutely. This is a perfect example. All right. Is this a method of teaching that would have been used by Jesus when Jesus was around? Why not? That didn't exist. We'll talk more about that as we go forward, but those are issues that will emerge as well. But these are doctrinal issues, okay? This is not cultural issues. This is not anything like that, but rather doctrinal book, chapter, verse kinds of things. All right. So we talked about it a second ago, but I want to come back to it then. So this change in rule that went from local churches who had a plurality of elders to that of a bishop. Remember, the churches, each church would have a high-ranking elder, a bishop that ranked over the others, and then there were bishops that were higher in other places as well. This ultimately led to, as we saw the other night, certain bishops having more power than others. Right? In a simplest form, city bishops, more power than rural bishops, capital bishops having more power than city bishops. It makes sense. You know, we see the larger area has more control than the other. That's how it would play out over time. And so by the end of the 2nd century, which we talked about there just a second ago, there had also developed a very clear distinction. And I want you to look at these two words here in the first bullet point. A clear distinction between clergy and laity. Okay, these are not words that will be very familiar to the Church of Christ student. We don't use these words very often. But these are both words that would be very familiar to a large number of Christians around the world. And what this was when you had a plurality of elders, but then you made one elder head of the other elders, that person ranks a bit higher. And then if there's a church in Lexington whose elder ranks sort of over the ones in Lancaster and Stanford and Danville, then they rank a little higher as well. So what this word clergy means is this is the religious leader in the church. Okay? Laity is you. All right? They might occasionally say that you are a lay preacher. Tom, if you were to preach on Sunday, the word they might use would be lay preacher, meaning that he's not a standard typical preacher. He's just being asked to speak. I might get lumped into the clergy group. I don't want to be lumped into that because I'm no different than anybody else who might go up here and speak or teach, but I might be lumped into that group as well. But this roots back, and we said this just a second ago, that they had a hard time leaving Judaism, that this roots back to the high priest of Judaism. And the high priest, who was the high priest in the Jewish faith? I don't need a person's name, but maybe what was the job of the high priest? So the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies once a year and make a sacrifice for all the people. So what if your high priest died? Got to get a new one because you can't be it, right? So that's an example of clergy and laity, even those words weren't used there at the time. So we see then this concept of Judaism still sort of existing within Christianity. And so clergy, as we said here, formal leaders here, they came to be sort of exalted. They were a little higher ranking than the regular parishioners. In many cases, it might even be new clothes. It might be formal attire of some kind as well. Now, I don't have scriptures for you to look at right here. Anybody know why? Don't have any. It was not addressed. All right. So this is something that becomes an issue. This is something that becomes something over time. Again, I've said this numerous times. This is not something that happened in one day. This is something that happens over a period of time. Excuse me. So if we look at this, we kind of already talked about this, but the clergy, the religious leaders become that. And so what this led to was it led to a rise in words to describe the person who was the highest ranking person. Okay. Now, we use the word elder to describe who? Elders. But I don't usually refer to Ben as Elder Ben. I guess I could because he does hold that job, but the same way that you could call me Teacher Daniel, I guess. But I'm not going to, that's not a title that I necessarily would wear. But these are words that we start to see. And there's more, but I'm going to use these two as examples. The title of Father and the title of Reverend. And neither one of those are mentioned in the scripture. In fact, Father, we're going to look here and just see, is sort of actually mentioned to not be used. We're going to look at all three things right here. This is Matthew 23, verses 8 through 10. Mary, do you care to read that one? All right, so if we look at this, but you do not be called rabbi. Now, this is very interesting because rabbi means what? Teacher. And the word rabbi is used often in the Old Testament. And Jesus is called rabbi quite often. But we're saying, do not call one rabbi. Do not call anyone on earth what? Your father. Now, just be clear for a second. My father is in the room. Who is my father? All right. Can I not call him father? Yeah, I can. That's a distinction that we have with father and mother. Okay. I'm not calling him that in the religious sense. And it doesn't matter if it doesn't matter if Ben becomes the greatest preacher in all the world or whatever it might be. He's not going to be father to me. He will never be my parent, as it were. And then we use the word here. It says, do not be called teachers, for one is your teacher, the Christ. One. And the point being is that who is the highest ranking person in Christianity? Jesus. Where do we all rank under that? It's a flat line though, right? It's a flat line. If there's 10 trillion people, it's a flat line here, and then Jesus is here. There's not multiple stories to this building. First Peter, go ahead, Ben. Right?
Love to be called rabbi. It wasn't just teacher, but it also means one that is greater than I.
Yeah.
It's elevate yourself a lot more than just
so let's go to 1 Peter. This is 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 5, and then verse 9. You'll see the ellipse there, the three periods. That's when we jump to the other verse. Mary, do you care to read this one? I don't think I've highlighted. I didn't. All right. So this is what we see from 1 Peter. It says that you also, and we could have put the first four verses, but I didn't want to go all the way back. But you also, and that's a lowercase y-o-u. That's me and you. It says you also as living stones. What does that mean? Living stones. Yes. We are a functioning part of the church. As we are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood. I want you to look at this, a holy priesthood right here. We'll see that word again here in just a second. To offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus. And that's what we do. That's what the church does. But it says then you are a chosen generation. You, all right? Who is the you here? Guys, there's been a lot more generations than one since the day that Peter wrote this. So who is the holy generation? Christians. And generation here is not 20 years and then the next generation, all Christians right here. And you are a chosen generation, a what? Look at both of those words. Royal priesthood. Who is the closest thing to royal in the old law? The high priest, but you weren't that. Okay? But a royal priesthood, anytime the word hood is in there, there's more than one. Right? If it's a neighborhood, we don't have, those of you that live out in the county and there's nobody that lives within 20 miles of you, you don't live in a neighborhood. A neighborhood is a lot of houses, right? A brotherhood is a group of people that share something in common. A priesthood, all of you are priests in the church. Not a capital P. You're not hearing confession, but we all serve the job as a priest. By that you can proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into light. So my job as a priest in church is the same as yours. What's our job? What's our task according to what we read here? Proclaim the praises. So that's not really a conversation I wanted to have tonight. We'll hold off on that for just a second. I want to go on to the next one here. This is Revelation chapter 1, verses 5 and 6. So these terms that we would use here. Tony, do you care to read those? So it says here that Jesus was the ruler over kings of the earth. All right. So no king, no minister, no president, no whatever term you want to be is going to be higher than. But then it also says right here, it's that has made us kings and priests to his God and Father. Okay. So we answer to who? To Christ, to God, right? We answer that. And so there's no, like we said just a minute ago, like you said, it was Boo. There's no mediator. There's nobody you have to go through, but I answer directly to God for my good and for my bad as well, right? A couple of things right here. We've already kind of mentioned it, but by the late 2nd century, I feel like we mentioned that several times here this evening. Those bishops had started to take over the authority of other elders. We talked about this the other night, but I want to look at an example here. This is 3 John verses, I think I wrote that wrong. 3 John, it should be verse 9 and 10. There's no chapter 9 in 3 John. If there was, it'd be a lot longer than it actually is. 3 John, verse 9 and 10. Connie, do you care to read this? Diotrephes. This is an example of, in Bible times, an elder sort of rising above the other elders. We read here the Diotrephes, it says here, he loves to have preeminence. Not just eminence. Eminence is the high point. Preeminence is even higher. And so we've got elders, but this is the higher ranking elder here, as it were. And it comes down here, it says that he wasn't content with everything, but he makes the decision about the brethren. Well, will not accept you if that were to be the case. And he forbids those who wish to, putting them out of the church. So let's go back to what we read, what Tom read at the very beginning. Who do you think Diotrephes would have wanted to speak to from James chapter 2? The person who was dressed in fine gold or the poor person in rags? he's going to want to talk to the rich person. And it almost seems like that if you go back to the back and talk to the poor person, what's he going to do with you? He's going to kick you out. You are making the whole group look bad in that case. That's an example of even when the scriptures were still being written, that some of these issues were starting to emerge. Questions? We got one more thing here, I believe, but any questions or comments about any of that? All right. We talked the other day about the five leading bishops. These were the largest cities. This is where the church highest ranking leaders were. We talked about Alexandria and Jerusalem, Antioch, Constantinople, and then Rome. And these are the five largest places. But if you even got five, there's one that's going to rank higher even than those five. Right? As long as there's two people, somebody's going to outrank them, two groups or what have you. And so we went from the little rural churches to the city churches to the capital churches to one, what we'll see here in just a second, universal church. But these bishops came to be called patriarchs. The word patriarch is not used in the Bible as the term for elder, bishop, presbyter. Patriarch's an Old Testament word. Who were the patriarchs in the Old Testament? The fathers of the family. And who did God speak to in the Old Law, in the Old Testament? To the patriarchs. So the patriarch was a high-ranking person right there. But as we said, there's five major patriarchs, and Rome was the most prominent of the city. So then the bishop of Rome sort of the highest ranking of the other five, of the five cities, of the other four leading ones. And by the year 606 AD, the bishop of Rome, which is all the title even today actually is, became referred to or looked upon as the universal bishop. Now, when I say universal, I mean all-encompassing for the church. The other day, when we talked about the Nicene Creed, we talked about how the last part of the Nicene Creed said that I believe in one Catholic and Apostolic Church. And there were lowercase letters. And the word Catholic in lowercase just simply meant universal. There was one church. But now, the one universal church had become something different. As we looked at earlier, the title Father was now used. Notice my uppercase F in that situation. Papa in Latin, Pope in English. That's where the term comes from. So we've completed a change in church government. Took about 600 years. No, it took about 600 years, 550 years for this to take place. And so the point of this is to show that it was not some one time, it didn't just happen, right? It wasn't just, oh, one day they just woke up and said, this person needs to be in charge. I hope we've seen, and I hope you've enjoyed as we've talked about it, this movement of where it got to where it was. Right? It was the old Buddhist proverb of journey of 1,000,000 miles starts with one step. Well, they went 1,000,000 miles, but there were steps taken by a lot of different people that led to it. Now we hear this word quite often. We hear the word Father quite often as well. But the idea of Pope, a universal bishop, just simply the highest ranking bishop. Well, I hate it that Leland's not here because he actually asked me a question, and I'm going to hold off on. I'm not going to talk about it right now because hopefully he'll be here. We'll talk about that a little bit later on in our series of lessons. But does anybody have any questions before we wrap up? Yes, sir. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yes. Sure. Sure. And I get that, Ben.
I think a lot of it, more than anything else, is just power grab and try to bring themselves up. Christian churches today, a lot of them big denomination stuff, when they're at the title of bishop,
Mhm.
that they sign their name to right reverend, how much more?
That's a name. I mean, that's become your name.
Yeah, I mean, that's just
Sure.
really lifting yourself
Sure.
up. That goes against completely what Jesus is teaching about calling no man father or people.
It's also probably worth mentioning that as we talked about the Roman Empire, that this was a very similar structure to what empires and governmental organizations. And when the church these with the plurality of government, they're essentially governing a tiny group of people with a very small group of people. But over time, as it got bigger, sort of what Don said there, it made more sense for there to be a new governor or a new leader. And it made more sense for person A to be over groups A, B, C, and D, or whatever it might would be. So it's easy to sort of 2,000 years or 1,500 years later sort of cast stones at, boy, they shouldn't have done this or that. But sometimes these things are happening in slow motion, and there's a practical nature of it as to why it's happening as well. And we'll look at more of that going forward as well. Mm-hmm. Right. Sure. Sure. I think we used the word extravagant the other night at church in class the other night. One last thing. You'll see across the top there, patriarchs to popes to partition. One other thing, I'm going to save this for next week, but this happening did not set well with everyone. And it would take another 400 some years, but it was already happening before that the church, and I'm going to, from this point forward, for the next few weeks, I'm going to use the church almost as a political entity when I say the church, all right? But from what's starting to happen is that the church as it exists will split. There will be groups of people that will say, I'm not comfortable with what is happening here. I do not believe this should be happening as well. And so schism, we'll talk about it next week, starts to emerge, and then you'll see more and more splitting as well. But we'll save that. That's for that'll be for next week. I guess I should have. Anybody have questions before we